Hey, Orville Johnson here for JamPlay.com, and in this lesson, for you beginning guitarists out there, I want to go over the basic major chords, and I want to talk about how you move your fingers from chord to chord, because the biggest challenge, I know that you probably know this if you're a beginning guitar player, that the biggest challenge at first is how to change from one chord, to another chord, and to another chord, and to another chord, and try to do all that while you're keeping time with the song, and figuring out some organized way of getting from one chord to the next, because that's the key, to being able to do it in time and to do it faster. Like if you want to play some songs that are fast, of course the chords change faster. So I want to take a look at just our basic major chord. So if you haven't learned all these yet, we'll learn them right now. And we'll just learn them in alphabetical order, because you know that the musical alphabet just goes from A to G and then starts over again. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then back to A. So let's look at those chords. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then back to A. And I want to show you a couple different ways to play some of the chords. So let's start with A. Now the way that I play that chord is just with my first two fingers. I use my index and my middle, and I press down strings 2 and 3 with my middle finger, and then I press down the 4th string with my first finger. So I use 2 fingers to do it. Now some people, depends on the size of your fingers and the size of your hand, there are some people with small fingers that I have seen play that chord by putting 3 fingers on it, which I can't do. That doesn't work for me because my fingers are too big. But some people will actually put a finger per string and be able to squeeze all 3 of their fingers there inside the 2nd fret. And then some people just use 1 finger and take their index finger and flatten it out and play the A chord that way. So for that chord, you basically got 3 choices. You can play it with 1 finger. You can play it with 2 fingers, that's the way I do it. Or if your fingers are small enough, you can cram 3 fingers in there, play it that way. So that's the different ways to play an A chord. Now a B chord, this is where we need to learn our first bar chord, because to play an actual B major chord, what we're doing actually is we're barring, we're taking this A chord and we're moving it up 2 frets, or 1 whole step. 2 frets equals 1 whole step. And so we're taking those 3 notes and moving them up to the 4th fret. But now we also have to take, these other 3 notes that are in the A chord that we're playing that are open, we have to move those up 2 frets too. So what we end up doing is playing what we call a bar chord. So this will be your first bar chord if you haven't done this yet. And what you're doing is putting your index finger across all 6 strings on the 2nd fret, and then reaching up with your ring finger and flattening it out to get strings 2, 3, and 4 there at the 4th fret. Now some people, when they play the bar chord, they, put 2 fingers down and then reach with their little finger. It's difficult for me, but there's a lot of this stuff depends on the shape of your hand. That's the way I do it. So that's about the only way to fret an actual B major chord. Then our C chord looks like this. You probably have learned this one by now. And so that one has your ring finger on the 5th string at 3, your middle finger on the 4th string at 2, and then your index finger on the 2nd string at 1. So that's about the only way to finger a C chord down by the nut, is like that. Then a D chord looks like this. So we've got our 1st finger and 2nd finger playing strings 1 and 3 at the 2nd fret, and then we put our ring finger on the 2nd string at the 3rd fret. Now some people play this chord like this, like making a little partial bar. They bar the top 3 at the 2nd fret and then put their middle finger down to get that note on the 2nd string. So 2 ways to play that I've seen people play a D chord. And then the E chord looks like this, and that's pretty much the only way to finger the E chord. Your index finger on the 3rd string at 1, and then your middle finger and your ring finger on strings 5 and 4 at the 2nd fret. Okay, and now here's the big tough chord for everybody when they start out, the F chord. So this one might take you a little while to learn, and there's a couple of different ways to play the F chord. One is with a bar chord. So what you're doing with the bar chord is you're taking this E chord and you're moving it up 1 fret, a half step, and then you're barring the strings at the 1st fret. So it would look like this. See, one way to think of it is like if I play that E chord that we just looked at, but instead of playing it with these fingers, I get my index finger free and I play that same chord with these fingers. And then I just move it up 1 fret, put my index finger down to bar it. And when you make these bars, one of the things you want to do is what your thumb is doing behind the neck. You can see I've got my thumb pretty much right in opposition to my index finger, my bar finger. Like if I take it out here like this and show you, you see I'm getting this pinching motion. That's what's giving me the pressure to, be able to make that bar chord, is having, these fingers, my thumb and my 1st finger, kind of pinching down on the strings. So that's one way to play the F chord, is as a bar chord. Another way to play it is just to play a partial F chord. So if I just play the top 4 strings, then it sounds like that. And so what I've done with strings 1 and 2, this is the part that usually takes people a while to get the hang of, is you have to use your index finger to cover 2 strings. You're covering the 1st and the 2nd string at the 1st fret. And so I don't know if you can see this, if you can see the little ridges in the end of my finger where I'm touching those strings. But you see I'm kind of touching it with the end of kind of the pad of my finger. I'm not flattening it completely. It's more like I'm coming down at a, kind of perpendicular angle with my finger, and the end of my finger is getting both strings. And then I put my middle finger on the 3rd string at 2 and my ring finger on the 4th string at 4 to get those notes. So that's the hard one. That one will take a little while to master, because it does take a little figuring to be able to hold those 2 down with just 1 finger. But don't try to keep your hand and your wrist. You notice when I do that, look at my wrist and my arm. See, I'm not changing the attitude of my wrist and my arm from any of the other chords that I'm playing. I'm not having to do some weird thing of pulling my wrist forward to press down or anything like that. The rest of my hand stays where it is. So you just have to, it's all about figuring out how to get your finger to address those two strings. And then the other way to play the F chord, then this is used a lot, and it's really helpful if you can learn to do this, is to play those top 4 strings and then just bring your thumb over the neck and kind of right here by your first knuckle, kind of crook your thumb over there so that you can fret that note with your thumb. I'm making a little buzzy right now. There it is. But see, that's an F chord shape that's used a lot in country blues playing and that sort of thing. So you want to learn how to play your F chord like that too. So we've got 3 ways to play the F chord. The bar chord, and you notice that's where my thumb goes back behind the neck and is in opposition to my index finger, so I get that pinching thing. Then when I just play the top 4 strings, you see my thumb comes up over the neck, and it's kind of like I'm gripping the neck instead of pushing against the finger like that. So now I'm kind of gripping the neck, and I can either just play the top 4, or I can get my thumb engaged with the low string and get that note too. Now the G chord, there's a couple of different ways to play the G chord. One looks like this. So there I've got my ring finger on the low string at 3, my middle finger on the 5th string at 2, and then my little finger on the high string at 3. So that's a good way to learn to play the G chord. Now another way to play it, which you should also learn, looks like this. See here, I've got my little finger and my ring finger on strings 1 and 2 at the 3rd fret. I've got my middle finger on the low string at the 3rd fret, and then I've got my first finger on the 5th string at the 2nd fret. So you can play the G like this, or you can play it like this. So those are the major chords. Now let's take a look. The one thing I wanted to point out about this after we just looked at the different ways you can play these chords is now when you're trying to change chords, because that's the, you've probably been working on just being able to play these chords, but the big roadblock sort of comes in when you're trying to change from one chord to another. And so what you've got to do is when you look at a progression of chords that you're trying to play, it's really good to spend a couple of minutes thinking about how your fingers have to move to get from one chord to the next chord. And if there's any places where some of your fingers can stay where they already are, or can maintain the same shape that they have but maybe move to another string, something like that, any place where you can find those efficiencies, that's going to help you in changing chords. For instance, here is the D chord, and here is that second way of playing the G chord that we learned. Now let's take a look at these chords. When I'm playing the D, see my ring finger is on the 2nd string at the 3rd fret. Now when I go to play the G chord, the easiest way for me to play that chord would be for these 2 fingers to move down to the lower strings where they have to go, for my ring finger to stay right where it is and not have to move, and my little finger to just come down on the 1st string at 3. So you can see that if I think about it that way, here's my D chord, and then when I change to my G and back, that's a pretty efficient movement there. I don't really have to pick all my fingers up and change, as I would if I played the other G chord fingering. See there, I have to pick up all my fingers. I have to go from the D, because now my middle and my ring finger have to move up here. My little finger comes down here, and my index finger is just hanging out here doing nothing. So if I were playing a song that had a chord progression that included D and G, and I had to change back and forth between them, I think I would choose probably to use this G chord fingering as opposed to the other one so that I could make my movement between those two chords more efficient. Now, let's look at another chord shifting pattern. Let's say we were going from a C chord to a G chord. Now, in this case, I would use that other G chord fingering for my G. My C chord, there's pretty much only one way to finger that chord. I have to use this fingering that we've already looked at. But now if I want to change to the G, if I use this G chord shape, then all that has to happen, you see my ring finger and my middle finger are on the 3rd fret of the 5th string and the 2nd fret of the 4th string respectively. So where they need to go to be a part of the G chord is those two fingers can just lift up and move over one string each, and then they're right where they need to be. I don't need to alter their shape or the frets that they're touching. I just need to move them over one string. And then as I do that, my little finger comes down on the high string. So C, G, so in a case where I have a C changing to a G, I would use the other G shape. Now let's look at a slightly more complicated bit of thinking. Let's say we're playing a chord progression. Let's say we're playing in the key of G, and the chord has G, C, and D in it. So you might ask yourself, well, now I'm playing this chord progression key of G, so which chord fingering do I use? Well, the answer is that you're going to use both of them depending on where you're changing chords from. Like for instance, if the progression went like this, you see, I used both chords. Like when I started the progression, I started with this fingering because I knew that my second chord was going to be C, and that would be an easy switch. And then I went back to G, then I went up to D, and then when I had to go back to G from D, I chose to use the other fingering. So, it's all up to you. I mean, you have to figure out how to do this, but I just want to show you that, there are ways. In several of these chords, there's more than one way to finger them. And the best thing for you to do is learn all of the ways. Don't think that, one way is better than another, or that if you just learn it one way, then that's good enough, and that should be good enough for anything that you play. Because the point of what you're trying to do is be able to change the chords in time and have it sound smooth and, get your fingers in the right place, not have it all be buzzy and weird sounding. So you're much better off if you're able to play the chords in all the different ways that they can be fingered and then make intelligent choices. Look at the song that you're going to play. Think about, where the chords are changing, how the chord progression goes, and think about what would be the best way to play those chords to have your finger movement be the most efficient. So that's a little conceptual idea for you to sort of play around with in your mind. So ways to change chords. See you next time.